Nintendo recently released a gameplay demonstration of Tears of the Kingdom, and as a person on the internet who publicly adores Breath of the Wild, I'm contractually obligated to talk about it in some form. This trailer gave a ton of information about the central gameplay mechanics, and I want to take some time to look at them in depth. Before getting into those things though, I do want to talk about what this means for the future of Zelda, as I think this gameplay demonstration is a pretty big statement from Nintendo. Since Breath of the Wild's release, there certainly has been a bit of a split in the fan base, with some people loving the freedom and general sandbox approach of Breath of the Wild, and others wanting a return to the more traditional 3D Zelda game, ones with tightly crafted, somewhat linear experiences. And I get that, the central design philosophy of Breath of the Wild is at odds with titles like Ocarina of Time, Wind Waker, and Twilight Princess. While those older games don't give players the same kind of options, they do provide a highly polished experience, which is something that just can't be said about Breath of the Wild, as despite it being a game I love, there are a ton of rough edges. I know leading up to Tears of the Kingdom, a lot of people were hoping that there would be the inclusion of dungeons as a central part of the game, and we still don't know if that'll be the case. That's not what Nintendo chose to show off. Instead, they focused on the mechanics. And while this doesn't mean that there won't be dungeons or a few more things that we find in traditional Zelda titles, all of the mechanics shown lean into that sandbox approach even more than anything that was in Breath of the Wild, with the ability to create unique weapons out of things you find in the environment, as well as creating vehicles and just structures that will be able to help you get around. This game seems to be all about players finding creative solutions to problems instead of developers finding creative problems for players to solve in one way. And I imagine that will be disappointing to all the people who have been hoping for a return to older Zelda titles. So I think this will probably be the most divisive Zelda game there's been in a while. And along with that, it will be interesting to see how Nintendo decides to move forward beyond this. Will they continue to iterate on the Breath of the Wild approach, or will they create different strains of Zelda? In the ideal world, which unfortunately is probably not the one we live in, I would love it if they had different teams working on a Breath of the Wild style Zelda game, a traditional 3D Zelda game, and also a 2D Zelda game, as I think all of them offer something different. I love all of these kinds of games, and I want more of them. The question will just be, how will Nintendo use their resources? Obviously, I think this is the reality fans want. More first-party Nintendo games, especially in series they love. With that said, I assume Nintendo will probably just follow the money. It's hard to compare sales data from over the years as the gaming landscape has shifted so much. Games are more popular now than they used to be, so in turn, more people own consoles and sales numbers are generally higher. But I think the best way to look at the success of each Zelda game is by comparing the amount of people who bought each title to the amount that owned the respective console, or in some cases, consoles. The numbers I'm about to show are somewhat rough figures that are all based on online information that could be incorrect, but when examining the sales of the original release of each 3D Zelda title, the vast majority of them were purchased by around 10% or less of their respective console's owner base, whereas Breath of the Wild hit around 23%. The only other 3D Zelda game that's at the same level is Ocarina of Time, and it is also the only other 3D Zelda game with a direct sequel, which I think is telling, and could be an indicator of what to expect from Nintendo in the future. Majora's Mask sold decently well, but still fell far below Ocarina's figures, which I'm sure played a role in their decision to try something new when it came to Wind Waker. I know that Nintendo has a creative slate of developers who want to push games forward and follow the most compelling ideas, but as publishers, they are a bit ruthless, and given the popularity of Breath of the Wild, if Tears of the Kingdom sells anywhere close to that, I don't think it is an approach to Zelda titles that they will just leave behind. So yeah, it'll be really interesting to see where things move forward. Hopefully we do live in a world that will have Zelda games for every type of fan, and it doesn't just go down one path forever, but I don't know that there's any indication that things will ever be that way. To all the fans who were disappointed by Tears of the Kingdom for this reason, I'm sorry. But for me, a lover of Breath of the Wild, holy shit, it looks so good. Since Tears of the Kingdom got announced, I've kind of been on the fence about it. While I haven't doubted that I will like it and it'll be a good game, I also haven't necessarily felt a lot of hype for it, because from the trailers we've seen, there's only been a little information on what the game will play like. And as we know, it's set in the same world as Breath of the Wild. It was unclear how they would change the game to give it new life and a reason to explore Hyrule again. But this trailer showed a lot of that off, and I am really excited to see how it all plays out. out and how these mechanics are part of the central gameplay loop. So yeah, let's talk about what was actually shown in the demonstration. And I'm just going to jump into what I found to be the coolest thing, which was the fuse ability. This seems to be the biggest game changer in Tears of the Kingdom. It gives the ability to combine weapons with things like logs, rocks, and other weapons to make unique shit that you can fight with. With the ability to fuse weapons to things found around the world, it will potentially solve a handful of complaints people had about Breath of the Wild. I've always liked Breath of the Wild's durability system, although I do think the way it was presented had some shortcomings, and it obviously didn't work for a lot of players. I'm really glad to see that instead of abandoning the system completely because of the pushback, they instead found a new way to address it. And at least based on the showcase, I think it'll be a great approach, as it still encourages exploration because players will need to find things to combine their weapons with, but it won't lead to weapon hoarding or frustrations that come from a weapon breaking, as resources will be plentiful. The fact that you can turn a stick and a log into a formidable weapon is really cool, and it makes me excited to see what sort of things I'll be able to combine later on to make even cooler weapons. I think there will be a lot of experimentation to find the best combos, which I think will be really fun to do. This is a solution that I never would have thought of, but I think it has a lot of potential. Another huge shift is the increased focus on consumables. They are now set to a quick menu option as opposed to only being accessible through the pause menu, and every item seems to have multiple purposes now. The demonstration shows key size being fused with arrows to create homing shots, and white choo-choo jelly being used to create an ice arrow. I get the sense that pretty much everything will be able to be used in this way. I'm sure mileage will vary with some of the items, but it should lead to a lot of cool combinations. So I imagine that every item will have a passive use like they did in Breath of the Wild in the form of being a part of upgrades, recipes, elixirs, and all that good stuff, but they will also have an active use for combat and puzzle solving. This seems to be a big step up from Breath of the Wild, which did have a handful of items that could be used in this way, like you could hit red choo-choo jelly to start a fire, but it was pretty cumbersome to do stuff like that as it involved going into the start menu, making Link hold the item, and then having him drop it where you wanted it to go, which made it hard to be precise. But this seems to solve that entirely. By tying these things to weapons and shields, they make them way easier to use. In general, I love this change as it gives so much more value to materials. In Breath of the Wild, I made a fair bit of food and a couple elixirs, but I did end up stockpiling a lot of materials that I had no real interest in using. In general, I am typically resistant when it comes to using consumables, but based on the showcase, they seem to be a core aspect of the gameplay loop, so I expect that I will need to rely on them to some degree. So hopefully this system will curb my usual tendency to hoard stuff. I will say one downside of this system is it will probably lead to an increase in menuing. This isn't the biggest problem in the world, but there were a handful of times in Breath of the Wild where I felt like I was pausing a lot during combat to switch between weapons or runes, and it broke the flow in a way that wasn't always ideal. And I assume that this system will only increase the frequency of that. Again, it's not the biggest problem in the world, but it might lead to slight annoyances, especially as it seems like even if you have multiple of one item, you still have to fuse each individual one to have the effect happen. For instance, in the showcase, it is shown that there are 5 white choo-choo jellies in Link's inventory, but after the first shot, there's nothing fused to the bow anymore. I hope there's some way to have stuff automatically fuse if you're using a lot of it, so that I don't have to keep attaching stuff if I want to fire multiple ice arrows. I do think the menus seem pretty streamlined, so it shouldn't be too big of an issue, but it is something I felt a little worried about. The other ability that has me really excited is the Ultra Hand ability, which is similar to Fuse in a lot of ways, but is more about building things within the environment. I think this ability is going to give so much longevity to Tears of the Kingdom. It is an addition to the physics system that will give people reason to keep playing it years down the line to see what wild things they can create. The trailer shows off being able to make a couple different vehicles by connecting logs and fans, but it seems like there are going to be many more pieces which can create many more objects. My hope is that there aren't many limitations for what you can build or how big you can build things, as I think it will lead to so many incredible creations. Admittedly, I probably won't spend much time building anything over the top, but I can already envision some amazing and stupid things people will come up with that push the mechanic to its limits, and I can't wait to see them come to life. This has the potential to go so far beyond just making vehicles to get from one place to the next, and I think if the system is robust enough, it'll give players so much freedom with how they engage with the world. The thing I am most curious about with it though is how it will be incorporated into the core gameplay loop. Will it just be to travel across lakes, or will you be needing to build stuff to solve specific puzzles? Regardless, I think it'll just be a fun system no matter what, but I do hope it is utilized in a way that is meaningful to the main content of the game. It's incredible to have a system like this to just mess around with, but to really bring it to the next level, I think it needs to be important to the core gameplay loop. The other two abilities shown off in this demonstration demonstration aren't nearly as revolutionary to the Breath of the Wild formula, but they do provide a lot of utility. I think the recall ability in particular could be used in interesting ways. In the trailer, we see it being used to rewind a chunk of stone that had fallen from the sky, but there are almost certainly going to be other uses for it. And whether the mechanic is awesome or just okay will come down to how many cool ways it can be used. I think it'd be awesome if there were some enemies that you could rewind, and just in general being able to move stuff in the environment that can help you in battle. And there are signs that this mechanic will be a big part of combat, as in an earlier trailer, Link can be seen using it on a spiky ball that was being rolled down on him to instead hit the enemies who presumably were trying to crush him. I hope there are a lot of instances of this sort of thing, as it could be a lot of fun to manipulate the combat environment in this way. It all will come down to how prevalent it is and how creative the situations are. The final mechanic was the Ascend ability, which essentially allows players to jump through the ceiling of buildings and caves to get to the top of various structures. On the surface, this seems like it will largely trivialize climbing, which might not be a terrible thing. Again, it all really depends on how it's utilized. I assume they'll give some importance to climbing by having certain spots that can only be reached by doing it, and also some mountains that just don't have a cave in them. In general, it seems like a good compromise to address some of the problems that people had with climbing in Breath of the Wild. If the world is designed well, I think we'll add another layer of traversal while still making climbing important in certain cases. I also hope that they use this mechanic to subvert the player's expectations every once in a while, like going through a ceiling thinking you're about to get to the top of something, but then actually finding yourself in a dungeon or just some sort of secret room that you didn't know would exist. I think that'd be pretty rad. There is, of course, way more to talk about with Tears of the Kingdom. While the showcase mostly just focused on these gameplay mechanics, we did see some stuff around the world. You just kind of had to look for it. First off, the transition between the stuff in the sky and on the ground is seamless. It's part of the gameplay. You can dive all the way down, which is really cool looking and makes me a little worried about the amount of data that will have to load on my Switch. Breath of the Wild had some frame rate problems, and I don't know. I have to assume that Tears of the Kingdom, just in terms of its sheer volume and the chunks that it loads, probably will too, but that's just a guess. When they're showing off these dives, there's a ton of stuff that can be seen around the world that I am already excited to explore. There are these big symbols that seem to be related to the Zonai in some way, which, to be honest, I don't know all that much about them, but I do know that they're a big point of interest for those in the Zelda theory community, as there are tons of Zonai ruins in Breath of the Wild, but not all that much information on them. So it'll be cool to see if or how they play a bigger role in this game. I'm mostly just curious to see what these symbols are there for. As they draw so much attention, I have to imagine they're quite important and house something interesting. I hope it is related in some way to a dungeon or just some bigger piece of content, but there's no knowing right now. There are also towers that have lights surrounding them that I assume are probably Sheikah towers or something like them. You can also see these spots that resemble Malice from the first game that I guess will be hotspots for enemies. Additionally, there are these little structures with green floating circles above them that I guess have something to do with the Sky Islands. Maybe they get you up there, but that seems kind of boring, so hopefully it's something more interesting than that. I don't know for sure what any of these places will be, but I assume they'll be a big part of the core content of the game, as we don't see any divine beasts or shrines around Hyrule anymore. So these elements will most likely be the replacement for those things. Hopefully all these bits of content are interesting and provide some more diversity in content, as even though I like the shrines in Breath of the Wild, they obviously do get repetitive after a while. Anyway, while I'm not a master of Hyrule's topography, it does seem like a lot of this map's layout is about the same as Breath of the Wild's. But from what Aonuma said in the showcase, and even from the bit we can see of the landscape, it feels like there are tons of changes that will give new reasons to explore Hyrule again. I'm sure this is a point of concern for a lot of people, as part of what made Breath of the Wild so fresh was the excitement that came from finding cool secrets. And if the overworld is largely the same, while we might get new activities, there probably won't be new locations to discover. And yeah, I feel that a bit. I don't know how Nintendo will address this. I assume they'll overhaul a handful of certain areas to feed into that sense of discovery again, but who knows? Obviously, there will be new things to discover and explore with the floating islands. In the demonstration, we can see a lot of stuff in the distance that seems like it'll be pretty exciting. Like, there are these big structures that might not be dungeons, but I'd imagine they contain some sort of challenge that hopefully is reminiscent of them in some way. There's also some islands shrouded by a storm cloud that just looks really cool, and I want to go there right now. And most importantly, there are giant cubes. These aren't the most visually inspired thing in the world, but they could have the potential to contain some cool shit. At the very least, they'll probably be similar to the mazes in Breath of the Wild, which I found all to be pretty cool, although I do hope that whatever is in these giant cubes is a bit more complex than those. So yeah, there's a ton to look forward to. I've already seen a lot of people feeling let down about this trailer, as it's proof that the Zelda series is not moving in the direction they want it to move in, and also some people feeling that it isn't different enough from Breath of the Wild because it uses the same map and generally looks about the same. And I can understand some of that. I will say, to the second point, to me this feels a lot like the jump from God of War 2018 to God of War Ragnarok. God of War 2018 felt revolutionary in a lot of ways because of how much it shifted the God of War formula. It moved away from the more character action styled gameplay of the older titles to something completely different. There was a much heavier focus on narrative and combat that is far more up close and personal. For a long time, people were saying Ragnarok was just glorified DLC because in a lot of ways it looked like the first game. While I've always disagreed with these comments, I think I get where they come from. God of War 2018 brought such a huge jump from what came before, so given that Ragnarok didn't reinvent the formula again, a lot of people worried that it might be too similar. Obviously, when the game came out, all talks of it being just a DLC pretty much vanished, as the scope of that game is massive and there is so much varied content that goes way beyond anything 2018 did. To me, it felt kind of like the game 2018 wanted to be, but the team could only reach that full potential by having the experience of making something less ambitious first. And I think Tears of the Kingdom will largely be the same way. It is a direct sequel that isn't reinventing everything, but building off what came before and creating something more polished and true to the original vision of what they wanted to do. And I think it'll be interesting to see how people respond to that. In general, I think people are far more impressed by huge innovations than they are by perfecting already established formulas, so I wouldn't be surprised if there end up being a fair amount of people who think that Tears of the Kingdom is better than Breath of the Wild, but still had a better experience with the first game because of how unique it felt. There was nothing really like Breath of the Wild when it first came out, and now tons of games want to be like Breath of the Wild, so it doesn't feel as novel as it once did. Either way, these new mechanics seem like they will give so much versatility to what can be done in the world, and I'm beyond excited to see how it can mess around with these things. But yeah, let me know what you think. That's all. Bye.